Hey, knowledgeable producers. I know you guys are reaching the 1000 mark, and I was asked by the admin to make a tutorial for you guys to celebrate. So I'm gonna do a quick tutorial on vowel theories. Now, I have multiple examples of how this can kind of get done. And so I have a clean wave that's basically just a regular massive patch. And then from there, I'm gonna show you multiple examples of how to get there using processing effects and the like. And I'm also going to show you a massive patch that is done entirely in massive that has a lot of different components, which makes it kind of have a growl effect and has a lot of different filters and processing and stuff, but it's only in the synth. So I'm going to show you external ways of achieving a growl status with synthesizers, and then I'm going to use a strictly in software, in plugin with massive way to do a kind of growl thing using the wavetables provided in massive. So here's the original wave. There's really nothing too special on it. It's a square saw 1, a little bit of detuning on the pitch cutoff, full pan position spread, so you've got good stereo imaging, and unisono to 2. A little bit of wave shaping on the sine shaper, a little bit of reverb, a little bit of tube. Now, the first thing I want to go over is how growls kind of work and sound. So I have an example that's actually a recorded growl from a lion or a tiger or some large cat. And this isn't a super high quality sample. It's cut off at about 7 kilohertz, but it doesn't really matter because you can still see the harmonics that are being morphed inside the sound. So already there you can kind of see those peaks and you can see them move across the frequency spectrum. Now, a little bit of science and how growls work. So large cats have a little bit of a bone in their throat that vibrates while they're doing kind of the oscillation that small cats do when they purr. So there's a lot of different organs and there's a lot of different things contributing to vibration inside the throat, and as along with the envelope modulation of their mouth, which is really an acoustic envelope modulation, the shape of their mouth shapes that vibration that's happening on many different levels, and that's where you get that sort of phasing effect in addition to a lot of those harmonics being brought out. So the first thing that I'm going to do is show you how to do that very basically with a little bit of EQ pulls. You can get really complex with this, but I'm only going to do this with 2 specific waves. So again, this is the way that it works. If I play that clip again, you can see a lot in the mid-range of little things kind of moving, little pulls like going around in this area. So what I'm going to do is open up this one that has, so all these examples have Homicide on it. This is a distortion plugin that's multiband, so it can target low end, mid, the low mids, the high mids, and the highs. So I have a little bit of a low mid boost and a little bit of a high boost, and that's on all of these plugins. So that's gonna sharpen a lot of the harmonic content, because when you distort things harmonically, you have a lot more kind of frequencies to play with. So here you can see that there's a dip here. So this is what we call a band reject, and then up here we have something called a band pass. So in my highs, you have a boost here that's pretty wide. So it's got a wide bandwidth, or a Q as we call it, and then we also have a wide bandwidth and a low cut with band reject. So these are going to be moving independently of each other, and if I click this, you can actually see the automation here, and I'm going to add this automation, and I'm also going to show you the automation of the other pole. So you have the high one where it's moving upwards, and you have the lower one where it's moving up and down. So you have 2 different things going on. So if you play this, it sounds like this. So we're kind of getting somewhere. The reverb is a nice touch, obviously, but there's so this is just basic phasing. There's actually there's very little phasing going on here, if any. The phasing mostly just comes from the pitch cutoff, and then you have that warping coming from these two things moving back and forth. So there's that harmonic content boosted up with the distortion and compressed a bit. Now, note that this is a different style of EQing than I would be if I was mixing. If I was mixing this into a track, I'd have this high passed and boosted the highs a little bit. There'd be a lot more external processing, but this is in kind of an artistic form of EQing, just with like sound design, and this is just a basic example of showing how you can boost certain parts of the wave to kind of get that effect. So you have a scoop out and you have a boost, because the way that it works is that there's frequencies being masked and frequencies being boosted harmonically when you have that kind of growl vibration in nature. So it's a very basic phased EQ'd wobble. Now the next thing that I'm going to do is actually take that cat sample and vocode it into that wave. So the wave by itself sounds like this. So the same wave as the rest of it, and the carrier, the carrier is going to be responding to the signal from the modulator, which is the sound. So we want the tone of the synth to be carried through with the wave of this. I have a little bit of EQ modulation here. It's not as extreme as this example, and there is homicide and there is a compressor on this, and there's also a vocoder that's triggering this. So those are both of those at the same time. If you hear it by itself, it just sounds like this. So this is a lot more advanced. It has a lot more of a sound. This is a lot more of what you'd hear in a lot of just a lot of dubstep and a lot of stuff in that vein. Vocoding is used. It can be used artistically in a lot of different ways, but right now I just kind of have a wave form that is being modulated by the pitch. The thing is that I actually have some of these bands. This is a frequency spectrum, and you can actually target certain bands of these frequencies to kind of be boosted or cut in comparison to the other ones. So that kind of gives that vowel aspect, because you have these holes in your frequency spectrum. On top of that, I have the depth and the formant turned up a bit, and a little bit of the unvoiced, just so you can kind of hear this sound without the thing modulating it. So there's a little bit of a dry wet toggle going on. So without the EQ, without that little band reject scooping, it sounds like this. And this just kind of gives it a little bit more dynamic and fullness. So you can still see that those poles are being moved from the growl, but now you have this warping of the saw wave. So that's example number 2. The third one I'm going to get into is using a plugin called Wow Filter. Now again, I'm using Homicide to distort it, and Wow Filter does have a built-in distortion, but I don't want to kind of overdo it because it's just going to sound really bad. It's going to sound over distorted, and then the harmonics are going to be really ruined, and you really don't want that going on with your synth. So I'm going to turn this channel on, and I'm going to set this to vowel mode. So it's A into E, which is a pretty standard, it's just a pretty standard vowel in a lot of dance music production. And you can see this oscillating back and forth, this amount. It's actually following an LFO that's being triggered here. So this is just a sinoid LFO. The rate is 1/1, and the sensitivity is -24 decibels. The overdrive is around 30, and I'm going to set this to vowel mode. I'm going to set it to band reject, because band reject, as you can see in the vocoding example, is something that really kind of scoops out their frequencies and gives that morphing quality to it. So there's a band reject in my Wow Filter. The mix is at 100%, so the Wow Filter is 100% processing the sound. Without it, it's going to sound like this. And with the distortion. And finally with the Wow Filter. So this is kind of a modern talking sound. You can definitely warp this a bit. Do like an E into a U. And there's a lot of different combinations. There's long A's, short A's, like the German U. So there's a lot of different formants, and what this does is it basically takes these these formant configurations. So if I would go into the EQ8 in Ableton, you could actually see these giant formants, and it'll morph from one of these images to another. So let's say it's a double U into an E. It'll morph from here into the next one. So Wow Filter is really useful because you can get this effect without having to morph all those individual boosting poles. There's about 8 of them being used here, and if you really want to go for a more entropic approach and spend less time in morphing all these EQ poles, you can do that in Wow Filter because it has these pre-configured formants. It's going to sound differently with different filters. I prefer band reject for the way that it sounds, just because it's a more of a vocal growl. But things are actually going to have different effects. Comb filter, high pass. That's more of a chorus growl, but yeah, band reject is definitely the one I'm more of a fan of for this kind of morphing growl. Now, if I warned you about the overdrive because there's already omicide on it, but if I turn the omicide off and turn the overdrive up, it has a pretty interesting effect. The thing is that I prefer the distortion being at multiple frequency bands so that I can target my low mids and my highs, because the distortion on the low end spectrum doesn't really sound that good. So those are my examples of just using a saw wave. Now what I'm going to do finally is show you a massive patch that has multiple instances of wavetables going on. So this might seem a little bit daunting, but I'm going to walk you through it. I'm going to show you exactly what each individual thing is doing. So the final result of the sound sounds like this. Now I could set this to just a regular LFO so you can really understand how it sounds. So that's pretty cool. The way that I do that is with an AI, which is a multi It's got a it's a wavetable with multiple different harmonics. Bend plus is probably the best way to kind of have the synth read the waveform, and then there's an amplification so that I only get it when the mouth of the wave formant is open, and then the intensity is being warped. So by itself, without any modulation, I'm just gonna leave the parabolic shaper, the feedback, the sine shaper, and the tube on. It's just going to sound like this. So we're already kind of the way there because it's reading through the waveform at multiple different points and stretching and bending the waves. So the harmonics are really being put out. Now the next thing I'm going to do is turn my modulation on, and the phase is clearly at about 10:30, 11 o'clock on AI, and that's really going to have a different effect on it. So already you kind of have that cat growl thing going on. Now on top of that, I'm going to add the wavetable chrome. So by itself, it's going to sound like this. So it's more of a formant effect and adds that a bit of a high end to the synth. So together they sound like this. There's just a little bit of that high end added. And then finally I add frozen, and this is just kind of complementing the AI wavetable. So I have modulation, I have a ring modulation on Chrome, I have a position modulation on Frozen, and I have a phase with a little bit of tweaking on AI. So together, with the feedback and a little bit of wave shaping, the 3 oscillators sound like this. So this isn't a bad sound already, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to use filters like I did in the other examples that I showed you. And those are going to modulate things and then be sent to a distortion module and a reverb. So the reverb and EQ is already there. The low shelf is boosted just because a lot of this is lacking the low end, and I just really wanted a full kind of growly sound with this. So the first thing I'm going to do is a band reject, which I talked about in Wow Filter. So the way that this works is that the bandwidth, or Q, is going to show me how wide the cut is, and the cutoff is going to show me where in the frequency spectrum is. So with these three wavetables and the band reject, it's going to sound like this. And I'm also going to use a parallel filter setting. So in this send, it's going to actually send a parallel processing. So there's a double notch filter, and there's also a band reject. So the double notch by itself with these wavetables sounds like this. So it's kind of doing the opposite of what the band reject is doing. So instead of cutting frequencies, it's actually boosting two of them in the spectrum. So it's got a peak here, it's got a peak there, and it's moving that across the spectrum. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to set up a separate LFO that's moving at a different speed than the other LFOs that are toggling all these. So the amplification and the intensity of this, and as well as the positioning of these filters. This LFO is actually going to toggle where the filters are being incorporated, so you get a little bit of the double notch, but then you go back into the band reject. So that's moving the sound between the dryness and wetness of each individual filter while reincorporating each other. So without this being toggled, you can hear the band reject like this, and the double notch like this. That already sounds pretty cool, but I want dynamics going on, and I want these two filters to be active. So with these two filters up, and this LFO going on between the mixes, you get to sound like this. And that's a really interesting robotic growl. Now the final step that I did with this is actually do a little bit of performance at a 1 measure ratio, and that's just really kind of give morphing to the sound. And at a faster rate. So the reverb is going off at the end and the EQ. So this is literally just inside the synth, and it already sounds pretty good, and it already sounds like something that you could use in a track, but you can continue this by adding more distortion. So I'm actually going to add homicide on this as well, and boost a little bit of the highs and boost a little of the mid-range. So that really gives its own kind of dimension to it. So by itself, without the homicide, it sounds like this. And with the low mids and the high mids boosted, you get this. So it's a really heavy dubstep sound, and that's with two synths. It's literally inside the plugin and with homicide. So to review, we've got vocoding, we have EQ polymorphing, we have the use of Wow filter, and we have the use of inside synth filtering and wavetable shaping. I hope that this was educational for you guys, and congratulations on 1,000 members. I hope this helped you out, and hope to hear from you guys soon.